podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns, we listen in to a fascinating conversation between Professor Sheena Greitens of the LBJ School at the University of Texas, Tanvi Madan of Brookings Institute, and Jim Steinberg of the Maxwell School of Public Affairs at Syracuse University. They're discussing the fraught, contentious, and important three-way relationship between the world's largest democracy, India, the world's most powerful democracy, the United States, and the world's fastest rising economy, China. In their discussion, they give a lot of context to understanding the boundary dispute between China and India that began in June this year, as well as discussing whether that's going to have the effect of drawing the United States and India more closely together and which lens it's appropriate to view the U.S.-Indian relationship through. Let's listen in.
Well, thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Sheena Greitens, Associate Professor at the LBJ School at UT and Fellow at the Clements Center for National Security. Today we're going to look at the complex and lately fairly fraught relationship between China and India. And I'm delighted that we're joined by two terrific experts who can help us understand what is happening and how we should be thinking about the questions that come out of these most recent developments. Tanvi, let me start with you. We had originally envisioned having this conversation as part of a seminar on history and statecraft. And your recent book on the way that China shaped U.S.-India relations goes back to the Cold War context. And so I wanted to ask you, I really thought the book was a terrific examination of these geopolitical relationships. And you make the point in it centrally that American policy toward India was shaped by calculations about China much more than we sometimes appreciate. So can you tell us about the book's argument and in particular how it gives us some historical backdrop for the conversation about developments today?
Thanks, Sheena, for taking the time to read the book and for your kind comments. I have to say, I also have to give credit to Jim, who's my former boss and advisor, who I doubt I would have written this book, which started out as a dissertation, without Jim's encouragement, because it was a big project to take on. The book makes kind of a couple of arguments that I think are relevant today. I think one thing, if you're trying to get a sense of the history behind China-India tensions, particularly the boundary dispute, there's a lot in there in the book about that. But I think what my book was trying to do was make two arguments. One is that as people have generally seen it, the U.S. and they talk about the U.S. and India being concerned in recent years about the rise of China, not rise of China per se, but its behavior. And that has kind of drawn the two countries together. Now, this is considered a fairly recent phenomenon, about the last 2 decades maybe. And I remember while I usually think the turning point for the U.S.-India relationship came in 1999, there's a piece in 2000 in Foreign Affairs that Condoleezza Rice wrote where she talked about how the U.S. had looked at India through an India-Pakistan lens for too long, and it needed to think about India in the context of China more, given changing geopolitics. And the book argues, it looked back at U.S.-India relations right back to the start when India became independent in 1947, and argues that actually this idea of China shaping U.S.-India relations goes back to the very beginning of the relationship. And so that kind of shaping factor, that influence of China is neither recent nor episodic. So that's one of the points. I think the second point that the book makes is that the reason that history is important, it tells us something about the impact and how much, to what extent China can actually drive the US and India together, or frankly pull them apart. What is the extent on the nature of that influence, that shaping that China has on the US-India partnership? And it argues that the idea that that the US and India will there's a Ambassador Bob Blackwell said, I think in the mid-2000s, that if China appears as a threat, US and India will naturally come together. And the Indian side argued often, and this was former Prime Minister Manmohan Singh would often say, that India doesn't come together against other countries. And what my book shows through this history is that actually the US and India partnership to kind of balance China is neither inevitable nor impossible. And I think that's a lesson to this day that is relevant, which is it's not just a perception of threat. Yes, today both the US and India agree that China's behavior is a challenge to the international order, to the region, to each other. But I think what is also necessary is that the two need to kind of have convergence on, or at least a fair amount of overlap on the questions of the imminence or the urgency of the threat, as well as how to go about dealing with it. And arguably, even though there's a lot of overlap, even today on a number of those things, there are differences on some of those subjects. For example, and I'll stop there. For example, kind of how much China poses an ideological challenge. This is not something India, for example, cares about very much, whereas at least this administration is focusing on that a fair bit. So I think that history can tell us something about both how India has and can and will drive India closer to the US, but it will also tell us what those limits might be to kind of a US-Indian alignment vis-a-vis China, and potentially, if the two sides actually want to get over those limits, how to do so.
I think that's a very, very helpful note of caution as we think about what's unfolding today. One of the things that I'm struck by is the centrality of a line from the current U.S. national security strategy that talks about Asia as being defined by the geopolitical competition between free and not free, or free and repressive visions of world order. And so it's interesting to think about if the U.S. is defining Asia in terms of this ideological and geopolitical competition, how India fits in that. So I very much want to come back to that point. Before I do that, let me turn to Jim briefly and ask you to tell us a little bit more about the most recent context. You went to India about 10 years ago when you were with the State Department. And I know that you've watched this relationship as well as U.S.-China relations closely in the time since then. So I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit about what you see as the major changes or developments in United States relationship with India over the last, maybe 10 or 15 years.
Well, thanks, Shannon. First, it's great to be back, even if only virtually, on the UT campus, and to be with you and everybody else. This is a great topic for the Clements Center because, as Tanvi has so nicely pointed out, the history is enormously important here. And if we want to try to understand where these relationships are going, we have to understand where they came from. How this story ends depends on where the story began. And I think it's an important caution to realize that depending on where you think the story began, you get a very different interpretation of what's taking place there. Ironically, my last visit to India was 4 months ago. I was in India the week before everything shut down, the first week of March. And so had a chance, a number of senior officials and thoughtful observers in India just before, or just really days after President Trump's visit to India. So my lens is not only from a decade ago when I served as Deputy Secretary of State, but really just from a chance to see the impact of President Trump's visit, what the expectations were there, and the different ways in which that was seen. And I think it was useful to me, I think, to be there at that time, because I think it's important to see both how the visit was seen and what the two sides sought from the visit, to think a little bit about the evolution of U.S.-India relations and where this fits in to the broader U.S. strategy. As Tanvi has illustrated so nicely in her book and in her comments today, the United States for a long time has viewed India through multiple lenses, but many of them have been highly instrumental lenses. That is, how does the relationship between the United States and India fit into U.S. broader strategic objectives? And in many ways, we see history repeating itself again here, because for a long time, really for almost the entire early period of Indian independence, the lens for the United States was too often, I would say, not so much about what the U.S. and India had in common or what they could do together, but how the relationship with India fit into the U.S. Cold War strategy vis-a-vis both the Soviet Union and China, and the Indian ambivalence about being seen through that lens, and its reluctance to be seen as kind of a co-conspirator with the United States in its post-Truman Doctrine post-view about how to manage the communist threat. And in many ways today, as Tanvi noted, I think there's a similar set of aspirations among many in the United States to see India primarily for what the U.S.-India relationship can do in its own right, but how it fits into this broader framing that the Trump administration has offered, and the desire to enlist India into this strategic competition that the administration is embracing between the United States and China. And as Tanvi's book nicely points out, that frame never sat very comfortably with India in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s. Question is whether that will now change and whether the Indians would be more willing to be a partner or even an ally with the United States in a across-the-board new Cold War with China. And I think there the verdict is uncertain. Certainly, Prime Minister Modi welcomed President Trump with great enthusiasm, catered to Trump's desire for a large public display of enormous proportions, which had never been seen by anyone in the history of state visits in the entire universe, which, as Tanvi will also point out, he was not. The crowd for Trump was less than that for Eisenhower. And so there's certainly a partial willingness of Prime Minister Modi to accommodate the sense of partnership with President Trump and the alliance, but also some wariness, both on the strategic front in terms of being seen as an ally of the United States in this new ideological Cold War, but also on a number of other issues related to the bilateral relationship, particularly on trade and economics. And so this tension that Tanvi has talked about, this sort of sense that there should be some inevitability from IR theory or ideology about a convergence between the United States and India, still remains problematic, I think, on the India side. And I think, when the U.S. has been successful in dealing with India, whether it's as early as Eisenhower and Kennedy, or more recently with President Clinton, who I served with, or President Bush, President Obama, is recognizing that while the so-called geopolitical lens is important, that the strength and success of the U.S.-India relationship has to be focusing on its intrinsic bilateral nature and not instrumentalizing it in terms of how India can help the U.S. achieve other objectives.
That's interesting that that's a point that you both emphasize. It's something that I've seen reflected a bit in my own work about the export of Chinese surveillance technology, where the United States tends to emphasize the threats posed by China's exports of the technology, but often doesn't, at least in its public or main rhetoric, pay enough attention to the interests of the countries that have decided to adopt that technology, who often have a real governance challenge, like public safety or violent urban crime, that they see that the technology is addressing. And so getting that balance right between thinking about a challenge that comes from China and affects multiple countries, but doing it in a way that fundamentally emphasizes the bilateral relationship and the interests of the country that the United States is interfacing with, and in this case, India, seems to be hugely important. But I think it's very helpful to know that that's a perennial or deeper problem in American foreign policy, at least with the U.S.-India relationship. That this is not the first time that we've encountered this challenge, and that therefore history has some really useful lessons for us. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about if each of you would help our listeners understand sort of what happened in 2020, which is a hard question to answer in general these days, but specifically with the India-China relationship. Could you tell me, and maybe Tanvi, we'll start with you, tell me what is it that happened earlier this year in a nutshell between India and China? What's the situation on the ground today?
Sure. I mean, I guess when you ask kind of what happened in 2020, my response is what didn't happen in 2020. It's quite interesting in some ways and ironic that when Prime Minister Modi and President Xi Jinping met in October in India, they had a bilateral summit, what they call an informal summit, which is a bit of an oxymoron, but they met and they decided on, it's the 70th year of when China and India established relations, full diplomatic relations. And they decided to have 70 events, and they were supposed to be focused on taking the relationship to new heights. And they did take the relationship to new heights. They just happened to be in the Himalayas and not in the way that they had intended. I think the two things that have happened, and I think one is what Jim mentioned, which has resulted, I think, at least on the Indian side, in kind of, and even on the Chinese side, has resulted in kind of strain in the China-India relationship. Is one is kind of COVID, and I won't say too much about that, but I think it's important to remember what came before that. Kind of sentiment towards China was already deteriorating a bit in India before the boundary standoff happened. And what we know, and I should caveat this with a lot of what we know on the ground, it has not been confirmed by either government. They have both tended to be fairly quiet and nuanced about it in official statements. But second, most of what we know is coming from Indian sources. And so just to caveat that with what we do know is that since early May, at multiple points on the China-India kind of boundary, which is an undemarcated boundary in the western sector, there was one incident in Sikkim, which is closer to the eastern sector, but multiple points in the western sector in what's called the eastern Ladakh, there have been what the Indians consider Chinese attempts to change the status quo, which in their eyes means to either establish a permanent presence or hinder Indian patrolling in what both sides have agreed is both man's land, or at least had previously agreed was both man's land. Now, why this stands out, and I'll talk about just briefly why this standoff is different from the few that have come before since Xi Jinping has been in power, but why this kind of has persisted and become a more serious crisis is because on June 15th, while the two sides were supposed to be disengaging at one of these 4 or 5 points, you saw kind of a fatal clash between the two sides. We know that 20 Indian soldiers killed. We know there were Chinese casualties, but the numbers have not been released. That is one reason why this is different from, for example, the standoffs that took place between the two countries in 2013, in 2014, and in 2017, because there haven't been fatalities at this boundary, at the China-India boundary, since 1975. And that was partly because the two sides had put in place a set of agreements, protocols, mechanisms to ensure that these kind of situations did not escalate. I think there are a few other things that have made this different than previous boundary standoffs. One, usually previous standoffs have taken place at one location. This has taken place at multiple locations. Second, the level of aggressiveness has been higher. Third, the scale of deployment on both sides, because when China moves, India will match its forces on its side of the line of actual control, has been kind of more expanded than in previous crises. And I think the kind of other thing is that it is taking these incidents are taking place at locations that were previously considered more or less settled at this line of actual control. And so there's a sense in India, at least, that there seems at least like a Chinese effort to change the line of actual control on the ground, or it is an attempt to kind of essentially say everything is back up to be contested, even things that had more or less not been contested since the 60s. So I think this is where we stand. The two sides are in the middle of, and have been since June 15th, both they've talked about kind of getting back to their disengagement and de-escalation process. You have both military and diplomatic talks, but they don't seem to have gone too far in terms of that disengagement process. And India is refusing to de-escalate till there's disengagement. What India wants at this point is a restoration of status quo ante at the boundary, as it was in kind of late April. What China is now talking about is wanting a restoration of status quo ante in the relationship, saying, forget about anything that happened, let's go back to business as usual and remember that we are two countries that need to develop and will benefit from ties, though I don't think there's any sign of that happening till there's some movement at the boundary in a positive sense. And so far what it seems is they're continuing to talk, but they're settling in for the long haul, which means a pretty harsh winter in this very high altitude area.
Let me just follow up this, because I think, you asked the question, what happened in 2020? but just the question that way in some way influences the lens through which you see these particular events. Because some would argue, trying to understand this from the thinking on the Chinese side, that you have to look at what happened in 2019 to understand what happened in 2020. And most notably, something that happened almost exactly a year ago, which was the decision of the Modi government to revoke the autonomy of Kashmir. It's a long story. Your listeners, many of whom will be familiar with this. And surely the decision about revoking the constitutional autonomy of Kashmir had very little to do with Sino-Indian relations. But it had, at least by some observers' views, an enormous impact on Sino-Indian relations, because it implied that the Indian government was going to have a freer hand to take some actions more broadly in Kashmir, which includes the Ladakh area, which is the area in dispute here. And so some interpretations of what appears to be an aggressive move by China in 2020 is a response to the decision to expand or withdraw Kashmir's autonomy, along with a series of fairly substantial road building activities that the Indian government was undertaking in 2018, 2019 on the Indian side of the line of actual control. And what's important about this story is not to say who's right or who's wrong or how we should understand this episode, but to recognize that all through the history of this, each side is pointing to the actions of the others as the precipitating factor that triggered the conflict. And each has a plausible claim, depending on where you start the story, as to where the blame comes for this quite dramatic and quite brutal confrontation that took place a few months ago.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As someone who does historical work, I probably should have been a bit more careful in my use of the time frame that I offered.
It's more just that there's so many different frames to do it in, right? And it's right. You can start the story then. You can start the story in 2019. You can start the story in 1960. You can start the story in 1950.
Well, I think part of it also, I'm reacting to the fact that it feels like we've packed about a decade into the first 10 months of 2020. So I agree with Tanvi that what didn't happen in some ways might be the better.
Yeah, I think, the other thing is it does kind of, it is related to the question of Chinese motivations, right? And there's still a debate about why would you take, and I think the difference is in terms of which is kind of the use of force to try to change the status quo, or at least kind of the threat of use of force in terms of military. But I think there's still a live debate about, both why now, and that's easier. It's easier to explain because of the weather, and that's this is the time kind of forces generally move. There are military exercises that happen in the spring from which forces could be kind of diverted. But I think there is kind of this live debate about motivations, whether it was Indian road construction, whether it was this Article 370 dilution, whether it is COVID related. So Taylor Farwell, for example, has written about how his sense is that this is kind of, and not just the India case, he's looking at the pattern of China's moves on a number of different fronts, vis-a-vis South China Sea claimants, air intrusions into Taiwan, the Senkakus as well, charging the two Canadian scholars, and then kind of, pressuring the Aussies as well. And I think, the question is why is all this happening? Particularly at the time, you would think Beijing would actually be wanting to focus on its major competitor, the US, and not push, for example, India into Chinese arms. So why now? And why all this at the same time? And so Taylor, for example, has written about how he thinks it is partly because she does not feel kind of some sense of pressure at home in terms of some of his actions in handling COVID, and wants to show no weakness. And so he wants to show that he can protect Chinese sovereignty claims everywhere. Others have argued, and former Indian National Security Advisor Shiv Shankar Menon subscribes to that view as well. The opposite argument has been that this is the question of, why all this at the same time is a sign of kind of more of a strength, that others are on the back foot. So this is a window of opportunity. So I think this question about Chinese motivations is very kind of valid and does go back. It's not just a 2020 thing. The question though is, I don't know that we will know. I mean, people are still debating why the 1962 war between China and India happened. So I think it's important to know, but it is also very difficult to know as of now.
Well, let me ask a question of Jim here, because this is actually something I've been thinking about. Jim, can I maybe put this in the context of some of your recent writing about China, where you were known for this phrase strategic reassurance, and then I looked at your piece in preparation for this call about in the Texas National Security Review about what happened to U.S.-China relations. And it seems to me that one of the fundamental challenges is that even if we think domestic insecurity in some sense or leadership insecurity is driving Xi Jinping, the results are quite assertive or even aggressive foreign policy on a number of fronts, whether it's the South China Sea, Xinjiang, Hong Kong, or now the China-India border and the conflict in Ladakh. So I'm wondering, should we be connecting what's happening in the China-India relationship to these other parts of the world? And, how do you then see the U.S. approach to China changing?
So I think the key question here, and I think Tanvi has put her finger on it, is we have all these dots. And the question is, should we connect the dots, right? Is the level of activity around the Senkakus related to what's going on on the line of actual control in the Himalayas? Is what's going on in Taiwan connected or not? And as Tanvi nicely pointed out, we can't know for sure. We don't have a window into the deliberations in Zhongnanhai. And so the question is, what do we do and how do we think about a situation where the data is ambiguous, but it's certainly open to a rather troubling interpretation, right? You can certainly make the case that it got to be more than coincidence that all these things are happening at the time. So the idea behind this concept that I talked about, strategic reassurance, is basically that says, given this ambiguity, China has an obligation to show the rest of the world that we shouldn't connect the dots, right? That China, there are all these things that look troubling. Maybe there's a legitimate explanation, maybe not, but because they look troubling, it's a responsibility of China as a rising power to say, no, this isn't aggressive, this isn't troubling, this is not a thing that you should be worried about. These are legitimate responses to legitimate concerns. And so in a situation like this, my view is that China, if it wants to avoid countries responding to this as a set of aggressive actions and connecting the dots, there's a heavy burden on China to demonstrate why we shouldn't do that. And up till now, the Chinese leadership has failed to do that. That is, there are all these troubling actions out there, ranging from the topic we're talking about today to the others that you mentioned, South China Sea, East China Sea, Taiwan and the like, Hong Kong. And so China needs to resolve that ambiguity, needs to provide reassurance to India, to Japan, to the countries of ASEAN, the United States, to say, no, we have a legitimate basis for what we did. It's a heavy burden for China, but if they are in fact have a legitimate grievances or legitimate justification for what they've done, they shouldn't have any trouble answering that call. But that's where I think the problem is right now, is that the Chinese government talks the talk, says, oh no, we're just a peaceful rising power, but the actions seem inconsistent with that. And if China wants to be believed and not to have countries respond by balancing against China and the like, then it needs to do a better job of convincing others that its actions shouldn't be seen as aggressive and troubling.
That sounds like a tall order these days, given the number of fronts we're talking about. I wanted to ask you to go back to this question of, Tanvi, you said earlier that India is looking for a return to the status quo ante. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you see as India's option for pursuing that objective? And is that a realistic goal? Is it, what is it that is happening in Delhi and in India to try to get to that point?
So India has very few good options. These are all tough options. They come with risks. They come with, in some cases, pain for India as well. I think the idea would have been to kind of ensure that fait accomplis don't happen in the first place, that you have, and there will be questions asked down the line, why this was, why this was allowed to happen on the Indian side, whether there was kind of a military issue, an intelligence issue, and not just collection, but an assessment issue, or some other reason. But I think that in terms of the options, looking also at what India has done in previous. So, for example, in 2013, when China, the PLA moved to establish a permanent presence at one of these spots, which is again being contested in Depsan, which is it's probably the most strategically crucial location that is being contested today. What India did at the time, it was the previous government, they actually did a tit for tat, started building a presence somewhere else. So it was a kind of a tit for tat change in the status quo. And then they, in the negotiations, they said, okay, we'll dismantle those things as long as you move back. And so you've seen, for example, in the Doklam incident, though that's somewhat different in 2017, because it involved Bhutanese territory and India kind of showing resolve on Bhutan's behalf, it did get China to kind of stop construction of a road it was constructing and move back somewhat. But over the long term, China's just built up the infrastructure on its side of that line. And so strategically, maybe it was kind of, it evened out in the end. So I think one is to actually take some action on the ground, non-military, that will kind of, and then, also have negotiation side by side, which is the way this is usually done in the China-India case. So negotiated at the table. I think there's another option, but this has a lot of escalation potential, which is that India tries to kind of dislodge these forces by force. Now, this would be problematic both from a tactical perspective. In these areas, it's actually quite hard to do. You do have first mover advantage, but the other thing is there's a risk of escalation, and that is not something that I don't think either China or India, and I think this was the case of the June 15th incident. I don't think either side wanted that to happen and wanted to cross that line of fatalities. I don't think either side could afford a war at this point or a larger conflict. I think there's a third option, which is that China, and you could see it either alone or in conjunction with that first option, which is, I would say there's a fourth option, which I'll come to. But the third option is for India to try to use its other sources of leverage, economic leverage, kind of even using the extent to which it will partner with others, to essentially signal China or use that leverage. Now, China also has leverage on India, and it's not clear that leverage will be enough to persuade China to move back at this point. I say the final option, which is not easy, but it is possible, is that India accepts that it has lost this ground in at least some of these places, and then on other fronts ensures that it has both better deterrence capabilities, but also other ways of kind of ensuring that China understands that this has changed the relationship, and that has been the signal from the Indian government that China needs to understand this is not about the boundary. That if they don't move back, this is going to change the entire relationship.
And I wanted to ask both of you a little bit about the domestic politics of this. What does Modi or the Indian military or the Indian government face a lot of domestic pressure to go one way or another here? Tell me a little bit about how this is seen in India. And Jim, if you wanted to draw on your recent visit, I'd be really interested in hearing, what you heard and what the conversation was like then, and what both of you have heard from the Indian government or Indian counterparts since.
So I'd say at the moment, India's political parties are competing to talk about who's been tougher on China. So you're not seeing much, across the political spectrum, across even India's China hands, people who have served in government, who are, who have been steeped in the relationship, who have helped construct the architecture of engagement over the last kind of 2-3 decades. There's kind of a souring of views on China. I'm not even mentioning the public, where anti-China sentiment is at a kind of at a high that I have not seen for the last kind of 3 or 4 decades. But amongst the kind of government, and I think the elites, and I would say the government as I said, across the political spectrum, a sense that, China-India ties need to be reassessed. Now, there's debate about to what extent and how, but basically that you can't go back to business as usual, that there needs to be a wake-up call. Now, that wake-up call would require trade-offs, including guns versus butter and things like that I'm not sure India is ready to make. But at the very least, you're starting to see that conversation. And you've seen some policy moves by the Indian government. So the politics, I think, there is some kind of questions about how this was allowed to happen. But Prime Minister Modi himself remains a fairly popular figure. And people tend to seem to, at least from the surveys we do have, tend to have faith in him that he will not give up this territory. Now, this is not territory India held, but it is territory India, like China, claimed. And so I think it is tough for him. You have seen some people, there's been some criticism of him in India that he has not named China, for example, or not actually admitted himself that they have taken this territory. And some people sense that's for a domestic political reason, that he cannot show weakness himself. And so then there's some concern that, he will just give up this claim because he won't want to seem like he has lost, quote unquote, Indian territory like Nehru did, as his party alleges in the 60s. And so I think the politics is sensitive. It's harder for governments in India to fudge these things these days because of satellite imagery. And so I think, there will be some pressure. And one thing too that some of us are watching is there's an election in the state of Bihar coming up in the next few months. And 5 of the 20 Indian soldiers that were killed were from Bihar. And to see how it plays there, whether the Prime Minister's party himself brings it up, this is not the same as India's Pakistan relationship or rivalry. This is very different. So the Indian government tends to be careful about what it says publicly.
I think that there's a broad consensus in India, and that it's a one-way bet for the Prime Minister and any other politician to take a tough stand on this. I guess I would say, though, that I'm not sure I think it's an inflection point in the sense that I think we've already reached the point in which despite the Modi-Xi informal summit and the like, that the quality of the relationship, and despite periodic minor attempts to try to put it on a more positive track, has been pretty sour for some time. And there are a range of issues that are concerned to India: the Belt and Road Initiative, which has been deeply troubling in India, the continued relationship between China and Pakistan, the technology-related issues, the trade-related issues, India's decision not to participate in the Chinese-led RCEP trade agreement. And so, what we're seeing is, this has kind of crystallized the sentiment, but I think it is part of a broader sense that although periodically we see efforts by Chinese and Indian leaders to try to recall the good old days of Nehru and Mao, it's not, there are too many irritants in the relationship for this to be seen as something that comfortably can move forward, and many reasons domestically in India for political leaders to take a pretty hard line on China.
Okay. It doesn't sound like either of you see a tremendous amount of room for optimism at this point, which is troubling. As we move toward wrapping up the podcast, I wanted to ask you to come back to American foreign policy and American statecraft, and ask you both, what role is the United States playing right now, and what role do you each think that the United States should play? What should American policymakers and national security practitioners be thinking about as this relationship unfolds, and especially if it remains on the current trajectory? What should we be watching for?
So I think, just like Jim said, this is a moment. This question is coming up. What is going to be the larger, broader impact on the China-India relationship and the U.S.-India relationship? And I think I agree with Jim. I think it is going to reinforce trends that have been around for, I would say, at least in terms of this kind of triangle for the last 20 years or so. Most Indian officials would say the kind of souring on the China-India side really, they kind of trace the turn to 2008, the global financial crisis. But I think what you've seen, I think, is a moment of that it will accelerate certain trends of India's competitive and adversarial relationship with China. But I think the jury's still out about what this will mean for India's relationship with the US. There's still, while India and Indian policymakers have also instrumentalized kind of the US relationship to deal with China, they find the US useful for at least two reasons. One, the U.S. has helped India build capabilities, not just military capabilities, though some of them have been very evident during the course of this crisis, whether it's strategic airlift capability, which American equipment has greatly enhanced India's capability, whether it's kind of attack or transport helicopters, whether it's intelligence sharing. And it also tells you how much the relationship has changed over the last 2 decades and progressively kind of come to this point, multiple administrations and governments on both sides. So I think you see India kind of finding the US useful to help build military capabilities, economic capabilities, intelligence capabilities. But I think India also finds not just the US, but other partners as well, many of whom are US allies and partners, Australia, Japan, France, the UK, and more problematically for the US, Russia. It sees these countries as helping ensure a favorable balance of power in the region. You want to call it the Indo-Pacific, India will say Asia, that India alone cannot deter or tackle a Chinese challenge, and so these partnerships are useful. So I think what the US, this administration has been hoping that on the one hand, they do not want to see this crisis escalate and have said so. But on the other hand, they are hoping, I think, at least some are, that this will kind of get India to take certain decisions vis-a-vis getting closer to the US that they've been reluctant on. And India's like to diversify its relationship. I think will continue to do so. But I think this will give, and I think there are people here hoping for, the fact that this kind of, at least even if it doesn't accelerate the US-India relationship in certain domains, that it will reinforce that and give kind of India and the Indian government even with a permission slip to do certain things with the US that it might have been reluctant to do so before. I will say there are some challenges on both sides, which is for the US when it has to think about these things. I think it's a question of also Indian capabilities. This crisis has also shown that there are shortfalls in Indian capabilities, especially in terms of its ability to assess the challenge, particularly the tactical challenge from China. But there are also concerns about what this might mean for India's ability to play that larger role if it is tackling not just a continental challenge, Chinese challenge, but also dealing with a COVID-related both health and economic crisis. So I think that the jury's out whether this will have a major impact, but I don't think it needs to have a major impact to still have to mean good things for the U.S.-India relationship, so to speak.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Tanvi. I mean, I think the challenge for U.S. statecraft here is to keep multiple doors open to the deepening of the U.S.-Indian relationship, but resist the temptation to try to drag India across the threshold of those doors. Right? That we have to recognize that it's quite central to the Indian conception of foreign policy to retain a certain degree of autonomy and to make these decisions that India makes rather than ones that it's either pressured, coerced, or try to force into, and to let, to some extent, India be the judge of the pace in which dimensions we deepen the relationship. The one thing I'm pretty sure of is that India will never be comfortable with the concept that was once applied to the U.S.-Australian relationship, that India would somehow be the U.S. deputy sheriff in the Asia-Pacific. This is just not something that's very comfortable in Delhi. And so I think if the U.S. can exercise a certain degree of patience, a certain conviction that for a variety of reasons, both because of values and because of politics and security, that there is this growing convergence of interest between the United States and India, that the relationship is likely to deepen as long as we don't put too much pressure on it and have too many demands on the Indian side. I think we need to be candid about this. And I think the second part, which Tanvi also pointed to, which is very important, is to recognize that for India, the multilateral settings are particularly attractive. And so there are very few things that I'm willing to credit the Trump administration for doing, but the evolution of the Quad has certainly been a positive one. because it's a framework within which India can cooperate not just with the United States, but with Japan and Australia and other kinds of arrangements, which brings India in, not just working with the United States, which I think serves both U.S. and Indian interests, and takes the pressure off this idea that the competition is a bilateral competition between the United States and China, in which everybody has to take sides, as opposed to a range of different countries in the region sending a message to China that if China wants to achieve its goals, economic and political security, it has to take into account the interest of all of the countries in the region. So these multilateral arrangements are very attractive ways for the United States and India to work together with others rather than just bilaterally against China.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. Almost any country would be outmatched in sheer numerical terms in a head-to-head with Beijing, but that multilateral forum allows for a different kind of conversation and a very different dynamic among the participants. And so that makes a lot of sense in the present moment. Before we wrap up, any last words, anything that we didn't cover that you think it's really important to remind our listeners of before we close?
Well, the only thing I will say is, if you think back, there's always this debate about, the U.S.-India relationship, and some will complain too little is happening. Others sometimes, and this is often in India, complain that too much is happening. But especially kind of in terms of too little is happening and not enough, I think that's because it's often compared to kind of, whether it's U.S.-Australia or kind of U.S. relations with the other allies, the U.K. But if you think back, and this is the historian in me, that, 22 years ago, there were U.S. sanctions on India. And, you have today the kind of relationship I, for one, would not have predicted even 10 years ago that India would have agreed to do half the things that it's doing, particularly on the defense and security side, without or it wouldn't have done these things. And I don't think, and I think this is something Jim said that's very important, I don't think many of those things would have happened without shared concerns about China's behavior. But I think it's also important to remember that there are other aspects of the relationship that are equally important. And I think, whether that's the economic side, whether that's the people-to-people side, it's not good to have a relationship that is only, I like to think of it as a three-legged stool, the strategic, economic, and a values-based side. And you don't want only one of those legs to be strong. So I think over the next few years, it's really important for the two sides to not just strengthen that, keep that strategic side strong, but also strengthen that economic and values-based side between the two countries.
I agree very much with Tanvi on that, and I would really emphasize the people-to-people piece of this. One of the things that sort of got lost in the shuffle about some of the COVID era developments is the impact on people-to-people connections. And, a huge part of the strength of the development of U.S.-India relations over the last 30 years has been the Indian diaspora in the United States and the Indian students and professionals who've come to the United States under student visas and professional visas and the like. And there's been a serious interruption in all of that. And in the long term, it's all great for IR scholars to talk about this high politics as, sustaining relationships. But in fact, these more basic relationships, the confidence, the knowing each other that comes from this. And so the interruption in the flow of people and this sort of challenge to not just, the immigration from Mexico, but immigration from anywhere that we're seeing now really can have a very bad impact on U.S.-Indian relations. And I hope that as we think about that, we tend to these, less dramatic, less high politics side of the relationship and recognize that at bedrock, it really does depend on the support of people in both countries, and it comes from this very grassroots set of connections that have developed over the last 30 years.
Well, it really enriches and rounds out the conversation and keeps the three-legged stool, to use Tanvi's metaphor, from getting imbalanced. Thank you both so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure to have you both virtually back at UT and with the Clements Center. Again, thanks so much, and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks, Sheena.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.